Hello and welcome to this interactive webinar, Frac Quakes, Litigation and Seismic Impacts of Wastewater Injection Wells. I'm Brian Murray. I'm the director of the Duke University Energy Initiative and a research professor at the Nicholas School of the Environment and Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke. The Energy Initiative serves as an interdisciplinary collaborative hub for all things energy. Our mission is to advance an accessible, affordable, reliable, and clean energy system through education, research, and engagement. Today's event is part of our ongoing Energy Transition Speaker Series formed in partnership with the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke. Nicholas Institute helps decision makers create timely, effective, and economically practical solutions to the world's critical environmental challenges. We are pleased to have with us today Scott Pointer, a practicing attorney who will offer a history of the novel litigation theories and processes involving earthquakes created by wastewater disposal processes from oil and gas operations. I will now turn to my colleague, Kate Konchanek, Director of the Climate and Energy Program at the Nicholas Institute, to introduce Scott and moderate the ensuing discussion.
Thanks, Brian. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and I hope you'll find it interesting as well. As Brian said, I run the Climate and Energy Program at the Duke Nicholas Institute, and Scott Pointer, who we have here today, super excited. He and I have corresponded by email for years, but this is actually the first time we are sort of meeting in the way we meet these days in COVID world. Scott is a trial attorney and he's based in Little Rock, Arkansas. His practice focuses on mass injury and class action cases, including those related to induced seismicity, which we'll talk about today. He began his litigation career at the Air Force Judge Advocate General. So for those of you on here who are law students who might be interested in pursuing litigation in the military and military service, you could maybe ask some questions about that as well. Scott and I crossed paths a few years ago on this very topic of earthquakes. I was researching and continue to research about environmental and public health risks posed by unconventional oil and gas production. And I'd started hearing from people about these earthquakes that were happening in the middle of the country, in Oklahoma, in Kansas, in Ohio, in Arkansas. You'd see people talking about it on Twitter, getting woken up in the middle of the night or early in the morning with tremors. I flew to Oklahoma City and my female cab driver, as soon as I got in the cab, wanted to talk about the earthquake that had happened the night before. This was deeply unsettling, given that that part of the country doesn't have many earthquakes, so it was not something people were familiar with. There's a band that I love called the Old 97s, and they have this line that says, "She lived in Berkeley till the earthquake shook her loose. Now she lives in Texas where nothing ever moves." And that was sort of how life was in the middle of the country until a few years ago. And then we saw this uptick in earthquakes. And sometimes it was just sort of your bed shakes and it's, a scary way to wake up. Other times there was serious injury to people and lots of property damage, including in places like Cushing, Oklahoma, which is where all of our major interstate oil pipelines intersect. And so there was deep concern about infrastructure being damaged and lots of potentially bad outcomes from that. So I got brought into this particular topic beyond just starting to hear about it because the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission wanted to put a handbook together for regulators and operators to just try to figure out what was going on here and how they might mitigate this, because there was starting to be a connection made between these tremors and oil and gas activities, largely the disposal wells. So injecting wastewater back into wells for storage and disposal. The piece that I got interested in and worked on with the IOGCC, and then it didn't make it in the handbook, maybe for obvious reasons, was the liability piece of this. So, if your chimney falls off your house as a result of an earthquake, if your home or business is damaged, if you are injured, God forbid, who pays? How do we find out who is responsible for these earthquakes? And so that's how I sort of crossed paths with Scott, and Scott is bringing this class action suit in Oklahoma on exactly this topic. And it is these are areas of first impression and coming up with some pretty interesting arguments for figuring out how to compensate people who've been harmed. So I've been super excited to meet him and look forward to his talk today. Scott, I'm going to hand this over to you in a moment. Just a word to the participants. If you do have a question, please add it in the question and answer, the Q&A box, rather than the chat box. So we'll be looking and monitoring the Q&A box and getting to your questions from there. So thanks so much. And Scott, take it away.
Well, now you got me all scared because I can't see the Q&A box and I can't see anybody in any audience. I don't, this is going to be fun. And I should have said, first of all, I'm a big fan of the old 97s. So for you to bring up the old 97s is awesome. And
awesome.
I got to see them in Austin, the typical music, the annual musical festival down in Austin, Texas, and they were great. So a couple other things before we kind of begin in the presentation. I am a real lawyer. I have these books right behind me that shows I'm a real lawyer. It also shows that I'm a really old lawyer because nobody has these books anymore. Everybody is online. Also, thank you for the Air Force introduction. I really enjoyed the Air Force. So if anybody out there is thinking about out of law school going into the Air Force, please send me an email because I highly recommend it. It's a really good job. And then also before we get in, I want to say this, these cases are babies in the law. They've only been going on since about 2011. That's when the earthquake cases in Arkansas were filed. So we're only talking about 9 years, which is, nothing in terms of legal jurisprudence or anything like that. There have never been any trials. So none of the cases have been tried in the 9 years that they've been going on. So I've got a presentation. I've shared my screen. Hopefully everybody can see it. This is the title page. And I use two monitors, which means I'm going to look to this side sometimes to look at my presentation. My understanding is I got a 35-minute talk today. If I'm getting close, maybe Brian or Kate, you can help me keep track of my time, but I'm going to try to run through this. I do have a 4-minute video. And the reason I wanted to play it is it contrasts some of the things that happened in Arkansas to Oklahoma. And I thought it was an interesting, it's actually a news story that I thought was very interesting. So here's the things that I'm going to talk about in my 35 minutes. We're going to talk about how do earthquakes start? What is induced in seismicity, at least from my point of view, which is just not an expert. But I've been working with a geophysicist at the University of Texas, Cliff Froelich, and also a geophysicist named Wayne Pennington, who's a friend of Cliff's and is up in the Michigan, Minnesota area, and other geophysicists across the country. In Oklahoma, Todd Holohan at the Oklahoma State University has given a lot of talks on induced seismicity, and I've been able to see those talks and visit with him. So I have a little bit of knowledge, enough to be scary. As I said, these are very novel cases or in their infancy, only 9 years of litigation in earthquake cases. We'll talk about some recent developments in Oklahoma, and at the end, a question and answer session. So Arkansas began in 2011. It's really the first cases that there ever were involving induced seismicity. There was some, I guess, media attention to those things. And as a result, some people in Oklahoma that had similar problems found me through Google. And I filed the first case in Oklahoma in 2014. We'll talk about that case in just a few minutes. The only other cases in the United States that I'm aware of were filed in Texas. It was filed and then quickly dismissed. I don't know why, other than I think that the lawyer believed that the damages there weren't enough to sustain the litigation. What I mean by that is the damages sometimes on an individual basis are sometimes small, and particularly when the earthquakes are in a 4.2 range or something maybe smaller than that. And you can't justify bringing those cases because it will cost you more to litigate that case than you could ever recover. So you'll be upside down. And so I think that's what happened in Texas. I believe that there were cases filed in Ohio, although that's only because people told me that there were, but I never was able to find them. So I really think the only cases in the United States were in Arkansas and Oklahoma. And I'm pretty knowledgeable of those, since I think most of them are cases that I've been prosecuting. So how did I get involved in this? And it happened because in February of 2011, at night, getting ready for bed, we heard what I thought was a transformer exploding outside. And then all of a sudden, my wife says, people on Facebook are saying that we had an earthquake. Well, that earthquake from me was over an hour away, and I don't remember feeling anything. Oddly, I remember hearing something. But what we learned the next morning is that there was an earthquake up by Greenbrier, Arkansas, or Guy, Arkansas. And immediately I started thinking about fracking. And I started thinking about, is this, because it hit in an odd place for it to be a naturally occurring quake. And I just thought there's something here. And within a short period of time, we heard from our geological survey folks in Arkansas that the concern was wastewater disposal wells in that area. And so Scott Osbrooks was the guy at Geological Survey here that was investigating it. And then also Dr. Stephen Horton, who's over in Memphis at the Center for Earthquake, I forget, it's called CERI. But anyway, he also investigated it. And I visited with Scott several times, never got a chance to visit with Stephen. But through that, we filed cases in Arkansas. Quickly, a lot of people will say fracking. Fracking causes earthquakes, and fracking itself, the process of fracking to break open rock and get into the gas and to the oil, cause very minor earthquakes, not the kind of quakes that you would think that would cause any damage. So the process of fracking, I don't think really is causing kinds of earthquakes that are a problem. Instead, it's when the fracking process is, which it produces wastewater. In that process, it has to be shipped over, usually by truck, to a nearby wastewater disposal well. And in this picture that you see on the screen, the wastewater disposal well injects or disposes of the wastewater deep into the earth. Now, usually that won't be a problem unless there's a fault line under there. And typically what happens is we don't know there's a fault line down there until you actually disturb that fault and create an earthquake. So that's what happened in Arkansas, and it's what's happening in Oklahoma, even as recently, I think as yesterday, had a 3.2. So the Arkansas, let's go back to the Arkansas earthquake litigation. I filed class action cases. Class action cases is sort of what I began doing as soon as I got out of the Air Force in 1996. And so I have had a lot of experience in that, and I saw these as potential class cases in Arkansas. We filed those, but ended up getting pulled into federal court where class actions go to die, typically. And so we ended up breaking those cases into individual cases. And in that instance, I had about 35 households that I represented. The theories you see on the screen, these are sort of what we use. Not only did we use those in the Arkansas cases, but these theories are what we're using in Oklahoma. So this slide just talks about sort of what I already discussed. I'm contractually obligated to tell anyone that asks me about the Arkansas cases that they were dismissed. We'll go on. Arkansas OGS. Now, something that was interesting about Arkansas with these cases, our geological survey folks in Arkansas worked with CERI in Memphis and ultimately developed a moratorium area that looks sort of like an oval over the center part of Arkansas where these earthquakes occurred. Now, there were earthquakes in Arkansas in 2010 and through that early part of 2011. And And if you looked at the map, and I think I had a map back there on one of the previous slides with those earthquakes, an oval was sort of drawn where the fault lines were. It was a discovered fault, now known as the Guy Greenbrier Fault. And a moratorium on disposal well operations was created by the by the Arkansas Geological Survey and the Arkansas Oil and Gas Commission. And we hadn't had problems with earthquakes anymore in Arkansas. Now, Oklahoma. Oklahoma is a much bigger problem and a much more complex problem. There, Arkansas just had one area seismicity, and it dealt, I think, with 3 or 4 different disposal wells. In Oklahoma, there are probably in the range of 15 different areas of seismicity. I think clearly hundreds of disposal wells are at issue. There are multiple faults. We're looking at faults that are sort of in central Oklahoma, where Prague is also up in the Pawnee area, which is over closer to Tulsa. Cushing has one. Cushing is a little southeast of Pawnee. And then there's multiple faults kind of above Oklahoma City. And there's a lot of seismicity, basically Oklahoma City to the Kansas border. But that is a much larger and more complex problem there in Oklahoma that we're dealing with, and we've been dealing with since 2014. This is a map of all the earthquakes in Oklahoma that are 3.0 magnitude and above from January 2009 to present. Interestingly enough, in a 2015 U.S. Geological Survey started maintaining maps of earthquakes, and then the maps will say which ones are naturally occurring and which ones are induced. All of the earthquakes since 2009, I believe, certainly since 2011 in Oklahoma, have been classified by USGS as induced and not natural. This is a map in Oklahoma of the disposal wells. Maybe you saw a correlation between where the earthquakes were and where the disposal wells are. Now, this is a video. The reason I went a little bit into Arkansas and now started introducing Oklahoma is because this video does that as well. And it goes through how Arkansas kind of treated this problem a little differently. So let's watch the video.
To find out more.
It started out, it wasn't that bad.
Tony Davis first started feeling the earthquakes in the fall of 2010.
Yeah, you'd be sitting there watching TV and all of a sudden start shaking.
Davis lives in Faulkner County in central Arkansas, north of Little Rock and not far from Enola, the center of a swarm of naturally occurring earthquakes in the 1980s.
So, we were like thinking, okay, this is probably natural seismicity.
But Scott Osbrooks with the Arkansas Geological Survey says they also knew that some disposal wells had recently gone online in the area and the seismicity kept increasing.
People were beginning to wonder what's going on.
At the Capitol, the Oil and Gas Commission wanted answers. The state had gone from 37 earthquakes in 2009 to 772 in 2010. Most of them centered around the normally quiet town of Greenbrier.
So it went from a novelty to a nuisance. And then when the 4.7 happened, that's kind of where it became a nightmare.
February 27th, 2011, the date of Arkansas's wake-up call.
That was scary.
A 4.7 magnitude earthquake left Davis's home in shambles and split in two.
And I could actually see the separation from the house.
But there was no longer any split among scientists over the cause.
Oh yeah, there was a strong correlation that it was induced earthquakes. And based on that, the Oil and Gas Commission acted accordingly.
On July 27, 2011, the Arkansas Oil and Gas Commission voted unanimously to create a moratorium area around the earthquakes where no new disposal wells could go in and all those that had been operating were shut down.
It's pretty devastating to our little company.
One of the wells belonged to a small Oklahoma-based oilfield services company, which was forced into bankruptcy. Co-owner Mickey Thompson thought the action was unfair at first, but the former Oklahoma Independent Petroleum Association president not only came to accept it, he now praises it.
I have been saying for 3 years to my friends in the oil and gas business who I used to work for, they should look at Arkansas.
With a moratorium in place and wells shut down, the earthquakes started to fade. After peaking in 2011 at 790, the number dropped to 98 in 2012, and there have been no felt earthquakes in that part of the state now for 2 years.
That's enough, I think, for more substantive action in Oklahoma than what we've seen.
Thompson understands the differences between Oklahoma and Arkansas, both in the geology and the importance of the oil and gas industry. But he and many others believe it's long past time that protecting public safety take precedence over protecting oil and gas. And voluntary directives from the State Corporation Commission aren't enough.
We have an epic fail on this seismicity issue. You know, it's time for the leaders to lead and to do some things that may be unpopular with their supporters.
We're getting woke up 3 or 4 times a night.
Scientists in Arkansas aren't trying to suggest what Oklahoma should do about its earthquakes.
It's much more complicated than here.
Still, Thompson says we can and should learn from the Arkansas example.
They shut down several major disposal facilities permanently. The industry didn't collapse. The industry adjusted.
Tony Davis wishes government in Arkansas would have acted even faster. That 4.7 might never have happened. But he says at least they finally got it. The citizens are the top priority.
As people like myself work hard every day for what you have, it's my dream, you know, and when something's willing away at your dream, you know, it hurts.
Governor Fallin has said she does not have the authority to shut down disposal wells. The Corporation Commission says the same thing, which is why they've been asking well operators to voluntarily reduce wastewater injections. We requested interviews with both the governor and corporation commissioners, but were turned down. The governor was too busy. Commissioners cited legal reasons. For 9 Investigates, I'm Alex Cameron.
So a couple of things. First of all, Tony Davis was one of my clients, best voice of any of the clients I had. Oklahoma, that was a story in January of 2016. After that story, and maybe during the middle of it, and at least during that time frame, the Governor Mary Fallin, established the Seismicity Council of Oklahoma. Todd Holohan, that I mentioned before at Oklahoma State University, is on that council, as well as others, scientists and people from the oil and gas industry. The Oklahoma Geological Survey, the Oklahoma Corporation Commission put in controls to try to reduce seismicity, and frankly, they've done so. There was a traffic light system installed, which basically helped control either the curbing of volumes of wastewater or shutting down wells that seem to be the biggest culprits to the induced seismicity. And as a result of those actions, clearly there is a reduction of earthquakes in Oklahoma. In that 2011, 12, 13, 14, and 15 time frame, you had thousands of earthquakes in Oklahoma. That volume has gone down. Also, the severity of the earthquakes have gone down. The largest earthquakes in Oklahoma were the Prague earthquakes in November of 2011. There were 3 over 5.0. The largest earthquake, the largest in Prague, was 5.7. The largest earthquake in Oklahoma was the one near Pawnee on September 3rd, 2016. That was a 5.8. And then Cushing had a 5.0 earthquake in early November 2016, so just after the Pawnee quake. And as Kate mentioned, there was a real sort of concern about the Cushing, and particularly because of 5.0, because of the tank farm that's in Cushing. If you just Google Cushing and tank farm, you'll see a massive farm of oil and gas tanks above ground. And a mess could have definitely been caused if that was a larger earthquake or closer to the tank farm. It did devastate downtown. Downtown Cushing has a lot of historical buildings over 100 years old. And a lot of those buildings took a severe hit. In this photograph, what you see on the left is Sandra Laudra. Sandra Laudra was the first plaintiff in Oklahoma to file a case. She's sitting in her living room. You don't see carpet or wood floor or anything. because they had to pull all the carpets out because of the soot in their house after the earthquake. What you see on the right-hand side of her photo is her husband's knee, and also that's those cinder blocks or whatever. That was the foundation of their fireplace that they had to remove. Their home is an A-frame home with a large fireplace and chimney that went up through the second floor loft area, and they had to take the whole thing out because of the damage to their home. To the right of her and in the upper right-hand corner, you see Jennifer Cooper. Jennifer Cooper is the class action representative for the earthquake cases involving the seismicity around Prague in 2011. That rubble behind her is all the brick off of her house. Bottom right-hand corner are a couple of representatives from the Pawnee Nation up near Pawnee. The executive director, Andrew Knife Chief, is there with the Marine, I forget what we called those, but anyway, around his neck, and one of the members of the Business Council to his right. You see me on the right, and the far left is my co-counsel, Kurt Marshall, representing the Pawnee Nation. The Pawnee tribe is the first and only tribe that has filed a earthquake case. Originally, we had filed in tribal court, but jurisdictional problems there, and so we ended up voluntarily non-suiting in tribal court and refiling in federal court. With respect to that case, we have settled with many of the defendants on behalf of the nation. We have 2 defendants left in that case. What you see here on the left is Cushing. That's downtown Cushing with damages from one of the facades. This was pretty typical of Cushing. A lot of the old buildings that are downtown with bricks and other things that had fallen off the fronts and sides of the building. Upper right-hand corner, you see Sandra Ladra's legs. A lot of what happened during the earthquake is the chimney had was faced with rock, and rock was falling off the facade of the chimney, and she got struck in the legs by the rock. Bottom right-hand corner is downtown Pawnee, similar to Cushing, but before Cushing happened, they had a lot of damage downtown. A lot of the buildings downtown, a lot of the bricks and rocks and stone off the facades had fallen off. So, Oklahoma litigation, there are probably, in the give or take, 3,500 plaintiffs in Oklahoma in various cases. One of the things that happened in 2016 after the Pawnee quake, after the Cushing quake, is there were lawyers that do a lot of television advertising. I don't, but a lot of television, radio advertising, and even cold calling plaintiffs in Oklahoma to sign them up and file cases. So that's why that number is around 3,500. My firm has filed 4 class action cases. The 4 here are listed, and what they're about is listed there. So you have Prague, Pawnee, Cushing, and then we talked about the central Oklahoma, north of Oklahoma City, all the way to the Oklahoma border, and the seismicity at issue in Griggs is where that's at. So significant individual earthquake cases. St. Gregory's University, which is in Shawnee, Oklahoma, just to the east of Prague, had about $2.6 million in damages. There was a photograph, I think, early on in the presentation. St. Gregory's University, its logo building had 4 towers. Each corner had a tower. Each one of those towers was substantially damaged. One of them fell completely off the building. We settled now just recently with the last and remaining defendant in that case. So that case will be dismissed soon. We're waiting on the bankruptcy court. St. Gregory's had gone into bankruptcy, and so the bankruptcy court needs to approve the last settlement. And you can see there that overall those settlements are $1.5 million. And I can mention that because bankruptcy courts have to be notified of the amounts, and they actually have to approve the amounts. Laudra versus New Dominion. Miss Laudra's case was the case that went to the Oklahoma Supreme Court after we were dismissed originally. The argument was primary jurisdiction. The oil and gas companies were arguing that these cases have to be tried before the Oklahoma Corporation Commission. The Oklahoma Supreme Court unanimously decided that that was wrong and said that earthquake victims are entitled to a trial by jury. Pawnee Nation case is significant because of the fact that originally that case was filed in tribal court. It also involves a significant amount of damages, over $500,000, probably closer to $550,000 in damage. There are a couple of appellate decisions that I wanted to let everybody know about. The Lodger decision we've already talked about, securing the right for the jury. Cooper was certified as a class action case by Judge Walkley in Norman, Oklahoma. She's a presiding judge because the Oklahoma Supreme Court appointed her to that position over the case after the original judge needed to recuse because her husband was the director of the Office of Emergency Management and had responded to the Prague earthquakes. So Judge Walkley certified that class. New Dominion appealed that. The Oklahoma Court of Appeals affirmed the decision. And then recently, just this summer, the Oklahoma Supreme Court, sorry, my phone's going off, denied the petition for cert. Crown Energy versus Mid-Continent. One of the things that's happening with the oil and gas companies that are sued in these earthquake cases is that their insurance companies are denying them coverage. They're denying the coverage on many grounds, but the primary ground is that they have a pollution exclusion within the policy, and they're using that to say we're not going to cover this loss. The Court of Appeals said, no, that's wrong, and has said that the insurance policies are in play. And that was very recent. We're still within 30 days of that decision. So I expect a petition for cert will be filed within 30 days of that decision. New Dominion has a very light case to the Crown Energy case. It is involved in a DEC action with NACO. NACO was saying that they were not responsible and their insurance policies were not in play for a lot of New Dominion's problems. They won at the trial court level, interestingly enough, by the judge that had recused in Cooper, decided in favor of NACO and said their policy was not in play. The same issues that are in the Crown Energy case are in the New Dominion case. So, however, that is a direct file to the Oklahoma Supreme Court. So we'll see how the Oklahoma Supreme Court, one, whether they accept cert on the Crown Energy case, and then two, how they handle both cases. All right, that ends my presentation. I hope I did that within my time allotted, and I can take some questions and hopefully I'll be able to provide some answers.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That was super interesting. And yes, you are well within your time. So that's great. We have a couple of questions that have come in. Jason asked, and I was going to ask you very similar questions. So great minds think alike, Jason. So Jason wants to know, how do you track which company's wastewater disposal wells were responsible for the earthquake that caused damage or contaminated the water? And he's wondering, like, how do you keep a defendant from pointing to other causes or other operators? How do you attribute?
I got it. So first of all, I don't do any water contamination cases. All of these cases are earthquake and seismicity cases. So you need a geophysicist to do the analysis. And with regard to the Prague earthquakes of 2011, there was a report and published study by Katie Kiernan, who used to be at University of Oklahoma. And shortly after issuing that report, she moved on to Cornell. With her was Matt Weingarten from out in California. Matt Weingarten has served as one of our expert witnesses, along with Wayne Pennington. And together, what they do is an analysis of the depths of the wells within a certain radius of the epicenter of an earthquake. They look at how close that well is to the center of the earthquake. They look at the volumes of all the wells within that area. They look at pressures. And so they take all of those factors and basically do an analysis and some calculations to determine which wells are contributing to the subject earthquake. In Oklahoma by its legislature has eliminated joint and several liability. So it is important from a plaintiff's perspective to be able, through the science, to endeavor to give the jury enough information on the concept of apportionment of fault. And so what we have been working on from the get-go is having experts in geophysics do this work to not only identify what wells are at fault, but also the degree of fault.
Excellent. Jason has another question about sort of damage across state lines. So he says, how does litigation work if wastewater injection, for example, in Oklahoma, negatively affects the citizens of Kansas? If Oklahoma doesn't address the problem at the source, does the law allow Kansas to stop disposal wells in Oklahoma?
Answer to that last question is no. With regards to the Pawnee quakes and the earthquake in Cushing, you did see damage in Kansas and you did see damage in Arkansas. So neither one of those states have any power in Oklahoma to do anything in terms of curbing the volumes or anything like that. That's totally would be left to the Oklahoma Corporation Commission. In terms of litigation, there were even municipalities damaged in Kansas that reached out to me. There was a mill that reached out to me. Frankly, their damages were relatively small, and it was going to be very difficult to economically do those cases. And to some degree, they had limited interest in actually doing the case. There were also cases in Arkansas, close around to the Fayetteville area, and close to the Oklahoma border, where people had some damage. Their damages were quite small. Usually, windows broken, maybe slight racking of the windows where the windows weren't opening very well. Nothing significant enough really to justify filing cases in Arkansas over Oklahoma problems.
Great. We're getting a bunch of questions. I was going to ask one quickly, just when you were talking about insurance and it's this insurance coverage of the oil and gas drillers or the wastewater operators. I was also wondering, when we're talking about some of these smaller dollar item property damage, windows broken, shingles dropped off, brick facing falling off, that would be the kind of thing that homeowners or companies might sort of call on their own insurance to cover. But I recall that they were running into trouble with that too, of homeowners insurance not covering earthquakes, but wondering if what you know about that sort of issue, or if any of your plaintiffs tried to go that route.
It's across the board on that. So homeowners would file claims in a lot of instances on their homeowners insurance. There were homeowners that were actually paid, that had claims approved and repairs made. There were homeowners that got partial payments. There were homeowners that were just flatly denied. They would be denied for two reasons, or one of two reasons. The first reason would be you don't have earthquake coverage. That would be one thing that would be told to them. The second thing that would be told sometimes is you have earthquake coverage, but your earthquake coverage is only for acts of God. And these are not acts of God. These are not naturally occurring earthquakes. And so your problem was created by an oil and gas company. So we're not covering you. So a lot of homeowners were in that third category of denied claims, either because they didn't have earthquake coverage or their carrier told them, we only cover naturally occurring earthquakes. The folks in that category, some of them filed bad faith claims against their insurance carrier. Those would be the people that felt like They had the earthquake coverage, but they were being denied because they were only covering naturally occurring earthquakes. Some of those bad faith claims have been successful. I've heard of, I don't do any of those kinds of cases, but I've dealt with those clients and I've dealt with those lawyers that brought those cases, and some of those have been dismissed and went nowhere. Some of those cases were settled.
Excellent. So there are two questions here that I think I'm going to ask together because they in my mind, they might be connected, but feel free to separate them if you disagree. One, Henry Hood is asking, what is your view as the go forward path for drillers and disposal companies to avoid future litigation around induced seismicity, assuming Oklahomans want to continue oil and gas activities? And then a question from Milan Kair is, do you know if operators have been able to toggle down the fracking pressures to reduce quakes? And you had mentioned the traffic light system, but had not gone into detail on that. So,
all right. On Henry's first question, it's a difficult one. I was accused by presidents of the Oil and Gas Independent Petroleum Association, the Oil and Gas Associations in Oklahoma, trying to kill the industry. And I said, no, I drive a Tahoe. And so, I understand that we need oil and gas. So I'm not out to kill the industry. We have to figure out how we can be good neighbors and do these things responsibly. The hard thing is that we typically don't know the fault is there until after we cause a problem. Todd Holohan spoke about that in a lot of his presentations. But we've identified the problem in Oklahoma. We've identified the problems in Arkansas. It is, and it's to some degree working in Oklahoma, where wells that were definitely contributors were shut down. Wells that were close to being contributors, the volumes were toggled down, as the other questioner asked. So those are a couple of things to consider. The other thing that I don't know whether the folks out there know, but one of the things that we did is we brought Aaron Brockovich into Oklahoma, and Aaron has a water expert that travels with her that gave a presentation at Oklahoma State University where he talked about water purification. And he talked specifically about processes available now where you can take polluted water and purify it into even drinking water. According to him, and his name is Bob Bocock, there are already, I remember 2 plants, one in Los Angeles, one in Tampa Bay. Those plants are able to do that. The first concern of the industry was it was too expensive. Bob's position was, yes, but those processes are getting cheaper because they're becoming more prevalent and we're learning more. So hopefully we can get to a point where that will be economical enough to do, because certainly that won't cause earthquakes.
excellent. And anything more on the toggling down? Question?
Toggling down, well, that's working. That's one of the things the Oklahoma Corporation Commission has done through the traffic light system to explain the traffic light system. And I think this is about 2016. When an earthquake would occur, the Oklahoma Corporation Commission would put a red light on wells that needed to stop, just completely shut down. And they would look at proximity to the center of the earthquake, the depth of that well and the volumes of that well, and decide whether they needed to put the red light on. Yellow light meant that the Oklahoma Corporation considered them to be a significant contributor, but they didn't want to shut it down. So they changed the volumes. The permitting that allows for a certain volume of waste, and they toggled that down or curbed that volume. Green light meant you kept going the same way that your original permit allowed. So that's something that's, I think, is generally working. But you even had in Oklahoma back in as late as July or June of 2019, a very significant earthquake in the 4-point to 5-point range. It wasn't a 5. It was, can't exactly remember, but at least about 4.5. So you're still seeing earthquakes that are significant in Oklahoma, but I would say that the things that OCC has done has helped.
Excellent. So we also have a question from EP asking, well, first making the observation that they know there are a lot of wastewater disposal wells in West Texas alongside the oil production there in the Permian region. And EP is asking, have earthquakes been a problem there, or do you see, foresee a wave of litigation happening there or in other parts of the country where there are these disposal wells and a lot of activity?
So Cliff Froelich, Dr. Froelich at the University of Texas, worked on induced seismicity cases around DFW. And I think that was around 2010 and 11. I found him and used him as my expert witness in the Arkansas cases because I saw that being done where he was investigating that. Since then, there have been little pockets of seismicity that was induced seismicity. And I've been contacted by potential clients in Texas, and I've turned down those cases. And the reason for me turning down those cases is primarily because the earthquakes are relatively small in relationship to what we see in Oklahoma. The Arkansas earthquake that caused damage was a 4.7. I haven't seen in Texas earthquakes that are significant enough to cause significant damages that would justify the filing of a case. And the reason I say that is the lawyer is fronting the cost on these cases, and they're expensive. So as a lawyer, you can't go in and take those cases if you're going to be upside down in doing those cases. So I don't see right now that you're going to see a lot of cases in Texas unless you see a more significant earthquake. To some degree, Texas has sort of the same political pressures that Oklahoma has in terms of managing these problems. And so, it's kind of anybody's guess and probably more of a political question to know what's going to happen in Texas.
Mm-hmm. So, Brian Murray just asked about the types of damages that you're seeking in these class action cases, if this is purely compensatory of sort of, hey, there was this property damage or this injury and we'd like to recover these costs, or whether there's any sort of theory that people have acted in a, grossly negligent way, or some punitive damages might be sought as well.
Well, all the cases allege compensatory damages in terms of physical harm to the property and market value loss. Interestingly enough, there was a professor at Central Oklahoma University, Travis Roach, and he and some other economists have published a study on Oklahoma and the losses of market values on homes in Oklahoma. Their study shows that there's about a 4% market value loss generally across the board in Oklahoma where seismicity is occurring. What that does is it puts a value of about 2.1 billion as with a B, on market value loss in Oklahoma. So market value loss is physical harm to the homes and business properties are what we're seeking in terms of compensation. Punitive damages is pled in all of the cases primarily for two reasons. One, the allegation is that the defendants, the oil and gas industry, was well aware since the 1960s and the Rocky Mountain arsenal issues that they can cause earthquakes. And so the allegation basically is that the companies were willy-nilly in going about their business and causing the earthquakes. The other reason that we're pursuing punitive damages is, and just as an example, in the Prague earthquakes, where New Dominion is a primary defendant, we have testimony from the former geophysicist for the state of Oklahoma, Austin Holland, where Austin Holland said that New Dominion came into his bosses, and he was part of this meeting where New Dominion used its influence to have the Oklahoma government say that the Prague earthquakes were naturally occurring. Austin was saying at that time, and I think that was in mid-2015, that there was still not sufficient science to know either way. And he had drafted a position statement that basically said that. And he was forced to change that position statement to one that said the Prague earthquakes are naturally occurring. So those are the two bases for, or general bases for alleging the punitive damage. The Oklahoma Supreme Court in the Cooper case has certified punitive damages as one of the common issues that would go to trial in the New Dominion case related to Prague in June of 2021.
Great. Thinking a little bit more broadly, we have a couple of questions that are a little broader. One is from the regulatory side. You know, the news clip that you shared with us starts to get at this, but whether you think there are lessons learned from the ways that Arkansas and Oklahoma responded to this risk.
Yeah, I think, you know, that's a lot of Oklahomans wanted moratorium areas, and I would say those Oklahomans would be the more politically liberal side. We represented for a while the Sierra Club of Oklahoma. They certainly wanted moratorium areas. Frankly, I think moratorium areas are going to be really difficult for Oklahoma, one, from a political standpoint, but two, there's just so many different areas where there are necessary disposal operations. And so many areas that have now known fault lines. So the other problem that exists is, you know, there's areas that are producing areas, and you need your disposal wells within reasonable distances of those producing wells, because otherwise the disposal process becomes very expensive. So it's not like you can go out into Timbuktu, Oklahoma, where we know there's not a fault line because it's so expensive to transport the waste. You know, we're not just talking about a few thousand barrels of waste. We're talking about billions. We're talking about lakes under Oklahoma of wastewater. So to transport that, it would be very expensive. So all that to basically say that I think that the Oklahoma Corporation has done a decent job recently of trying to curb volumes and shut down wells that are clearly causing earthquakes. It's still happening. There's still significant earthquakes happening, so maybe they can do more in terms of slowing down volumes and just shutting down wells that we need to shut down. But it's a difficult, complex issue that is difficult from a science perspective and difficult from a political perspective and a legal perspective, because of the problems with the litigation and the problems that the insurance industry is creating, not only for homeowners, but the insurance industry was causing problems for the companies that have been paying premiums to cover problems associated with their operations. In other words, they paid for those premiums. They should be able to get insurance to cover them.
All right, we have more than one question. We're going to ask one final question just based on the order they came in, and then we will wrap things up. But yeah, we're definitely, the interest is outpacing the hour that we've allocated here. But another sort of bigger question, that first one was about regulators and sort of lessons they could draw. This one's about the industry. And the question is whether these cases or the issue of earthquakes can be used to make an argument for renewables or a transition from fossil, or whether companies were concerned that this sort of undermines their license to operate, their social license to operate. And so just thinking about reputation and how this earthquakes issue might play into that, if it does.
I don't know. I think that's a political question too. I'm not much of a politician. If you want me, my partner next door is a politician, so I can maybe bring him into this question. But
we could do another hour of this next week and do the political questions.
I think just personally, I think that we will begin moving towards more renewable energies. I think it just makes sense from an environmental standpoint. How long it takes for that to happen is, I don't know, because there's so many things that and to much of a degree, I think it's a political problem to move from one to the other. And I'm not sure that it's necessary for it to completely go to renewables, but that's just me.
Okay, well, good. Thank you so much for spending this hour with us. We really appreciate it. I think I'm going to turn things back over to Brian to wrap it up, but I wish we were all in a room so we could give you the round of applause that you deserve.
Wow, thank you very much, Scott. That was a really thought-provoking talk, and appreciate you taking the time to join us. I know the plan originally, we have been setting this up for at least 6 months. The plan originally was to come to Durham. To our audience, thank you for joining us and for the great questions that you asked.